Hi guys, welcome back to the Astroimaging channel. Tonight's session is on Deconvolution and PixInsight by David Alt. But before that, we're going to go over to our image of the week, which goes to Dylan O'Donnell. And let me see, oh, I see it on his screen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it right over to him.
Thanks, Adam. I just picked up a second-hand QHY9, which is a classic Kodak 8300 chip, and it's been my first foray into the mono stuff. So I used Hyperstar to image a bunch of hydrogen, oxygen 3, and sulfur 2. I put the sulfur 2 slightly longer at 3 minutes exposures, which is long for Hyperstar, not so long for regular narrowband imaging. And I mapped them to the Hubble palette initially, and then overlaid it with a 50% blend of just straight RGB data from the visual spectrum, and it came out quite nicely. But what I'm most impressed about is doing this jump over to mono and just seeing the amazing amount of extra detail you get just in those fine little filaments and that inner detail. But this is the Lagoon Nebula, and doing the S2 and the O3 really show you that chemical structure in the middle, where you can see the oxygen and sulfur in the core, and it really helps differentiate an object that you'd otherwise see quite red in that typical salmon pinky red hydrogen dominant kind of nebula look. So yeah, it's been nice to jump over into this narrowband stuff.
Thank you, Dylan. It's a great image. Now, okay, so what I wanted to tell everyone is Google is changing things a little bit, and you may or may not have already noticed that Q&A appears to be gone. Basically, they are pulling Hangouts on Air off of Google Plus and putting it on YouTube. I think that most of the features that we're going to need to use or probably going to be wanting to use may be on YouTube now, but we may lose some features. Q&A, it's gone. On YouTube, though, we do have chat, which if you view our event live on YouTube, you will see a chat box there. And if you are viewing this live, of course, then that may be your best way to get questions to us. The other option would be to leave us questions in comments. Either way, I'm going to try and call those questions out to David as we go. As always, we're losing Q&A, so we have to figure out a new routine. And hopefully in the next couple of weeks we'll have a good solution for that.
Yeah, Adam, one other comment on that is that starting next week we will be putting links into Facebook for the presentation so that you can actually comment live on there as well, and we can respond to comments in there. So look for that starting next week, as we'll be embedding the presentation in Facebook.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, and speaking of links, you'll probably notice that now just a link is shared as opposed to, well, the big Google Hangout thing. Maybe, I think that means we're probably all watching it on YouTube. So that chat box, woohoo, chat, there we go, I see it. Perfect, I have to say nothing else. David, if you're in the room, I'm going to hand it right over to you.
All right, thanks, Adam. All right, so let me start my screen sharing here. Okay, and I will flip over to my slideshow. Okay, so I gave Adam some data earlier, and you can find it at this link. It's in it's in this presentation here, but it's a 12 megabyte file that has the image data that I'm using for the presentation I'm doing tonight, along with an XPSM file, which is a set of desktop icons for PixInsight. It has this presentation in both a PowerPoint and PDF form. So feel free to download those, follow along. I knew going into this that it was going to be difficult to show some of the differences due to deconvolution, due to the video encoding that we have here. So I wanted to have everything in reference there, and you can check it out. So all that stuff is in there. There may be some minor differences between some of the screenshots. I posted this data yesterday to make sure everything was working with downloading it and everything like that. So there may be a few differences in there. I made a few tweaks since then. There's also an important part in here. I do some renaming of some of the images as I go along, and that's pretty important because I'm doing a couple pixel math expressions here and there. They're pretty minor, but they rely on images being named a particular thing. So just keep that in mind as you're going through the presentation data. So what is deconvolution? All images as they are captured by our cameras are convolved. They're blurred in some way. Astronomical images are convolved by our atmosphere, by the optics, by tracking, by vibrations. Maybe you're walking around the scope, or you've got a fan that's vibrating, causing some sort of resonance. All those things can contribute to the blurring of the object on the sensor, right? It also occurs as part of image processing, specifically during things like registration, or when you're doing any kind of resizing or rotation or anything like that. You're having to translate the image and interpolate it, and that causes some amount of blurring. It can also cause a little bit of sharpening as well, depending on which algorithms you used. But in general, any kind of process you run on an image like that is going to cause some sort of convolution. Luckily, our images have ready access to information about how or what that convolution looks like in the form of stars, right? So if you look at an image of a star, with say an infinite aperture instrument and perfect sensor and everything like that, what you would see is the star would take up 1 pixel. There would be no light outside of that if there was no convolution through anything. Of course, it's not true. What we get is a convolved star, and you may see something like the picture over here. What we call is the point spread function. That's how the point of light, the energy in this star, is spread across the disk, right? So if you look at like a cross section, a star, without convolution would just appear as an impulse function. It'd be just a spike. And really, what we get in our data is a cross section, this kind of point spread function that we refer to when we look at full width half maximum and things like this. So there's some limitations to doing deconvolution. Due to the nature of the math involved, there can be many results, potential answers based on the algorithm. So they have to kind of guess through an iterative process. So this means you'll never truly get a perfect deconvolution result. Noise also complicates the problem, right? So typically when you're, from a functional perspective, you only really can deconvolve high signal to noise ratio areas. These regions that are in the background and much more noisy, you'd have to hope that they have very low, little information content, high frequency information content anyway. So it's typically not an issue. But you have these kind of limitations here. It's not going to correct for variations in the point spread function over the surface of the image. So if you have like field rotation, where the stars are curved, at different angles across the field, or you have image tilt where you have stars that are, one full width half maximum up in the upper left and a different one at the lower left, or a different angle or something like that, it's not going to correct for those, at least not the PixInsight implementation of this. An accurate measurement of the point spread function is critical, right? Because what we're trying to do is undo how this image was convolved, and so we need to get as accurate of a measurement of this convolution, the point spread function, as we can. Are there any questions on those slides before I move into the general flow here?
I haven't gotten any questions yet.
All right. So the general flow is something like this. A couple of these can be done in different orders, but for the most part, you're measuring the point spread function for an image. You're creating a star mask. You may or may not be creating some sort of convolution mask, some sort of intensity mask that limits the effect of the deconvolution process. You'll tweak some of the parameters on the deconvolution process itself. and then you'll deconvolve the image. So I'll run through these pretty quickly, and then we'll go through the functional example. So the dynamic PSF portion here is what we're using to measure the point spread function of the star. And ultimately what this is doing is just sampling a bunch of the stars. So you go in, you bring up dynamic PSF, and you click on your active image, and then you click around on all the different stars. It's an interactive tool, so you have to click on each one, so it's a little bit of a pain to do that. In general, I try to pick stars that aren't too bright or too dim. If they're too dim, you may not get a very accurate model of what the star looks like. And if they're too bright, they may be clipped. Generally, you can see this, a standard point spread function of a star is more like a Moffett function or Lorentzian function. They tend not to be Gaussian. And so typically what you'll see when stars are too dim or they're overexposed is it will fit them with a Gaussian model instead. So generally, when I click on a star and it shows that the model, which you can see here, this left column shows the function that it's using to describe the star. If that shows up as Gaussian, I just remove it. I won't include it in my analysis.
Hey, David.
Yeah.
So sometimes the Moffats come up as different numbers. Can you explain why and/or if any numbers are okay?
Yeah, any numbers are okay. Moffat and Lorentzian equations are essentially the same equation. There's an additional beta exponent in a Moffat equation. But you can assume a beta equals 1 gives you a Lorentzian function. So what you're seeing in these different ones, like a Moffat 4 or a Moffat 10, is the beta exponent. But they're all interchangeable in terms of how they're averaged together. Gaussian is a different function. It can't be averaged together with the other ones, at least not in terms of the equation. So there's two aspects that we'll go through here in a second. But in general, you want them all to be Moffat or Lorentzian.
David, I have another question.
Sure.
Does this process, can you fix eccentricity with this process?
There is a way to fix eccentricity with deconvolution. This is not the best process to do that. There's a I think it's called motion blur or something like that tab for deconvolution that's really designed for doing that. Deconvolution as it is here, we tend to try to protect the stars because they'll do something called ringing, which we'll talk a little bit about later. So we tend not to affect the stars too much here, although you do get some amount of correction on them, but it tends not to be that significant. Did that answer your question, Tolga?
Yes, thank you.
All right, so in general, I try to sample about 25 stars at a minimum. You'll see in the example that I selected quite a few. I selected like 100. The more the better in this case, right? And in my particular data set, there was actually field rotation in the image data. This was taken during like a public star party, and there was no attention paid to polar alignment. It was just set up and go, level and use a compass and make things work, right? So there's a fair amount of field rotation. So I try to get as many as stars as possible to average out that data, right? Once you've sampled on enough stars, there's a couple icons down in the lower right, which you can see here. There's this little blue camera icon, and there's this little paper icon with a sigma symbol on it. So the first one generates a synthetic PSF, and it does this by modeling the point spread for each of these things and then averaging them together, right? So it's actually making a model internally and averaging them together. The second one is actually taking the equations and making a generic equation that fits all of those, right? So it's not exactly the same, and you will get slightly different results, and that's one major point that I'll make here. For some reason, and I don't know why this is exactly what they're doing under the covers in PixInsight, but the sigma function here will generate a point spread function that has the correct aperture, the correct size to cover the point spread function accurately. But it doesn't have the correct orientation. So if there's any kind of angle of eccentricity to the star, that won't be correct. The first one, the little blue camera icon on here, when you use that, it will be the correct point spread function matching the angle and shape of your point spread function, but the size of the box that it's rendered in may not be correct. So typically I do both. I'll do the blue camera on the main DynamicPSF window first, generate an image, and it'll come off as labeled PSF, or if you have some other ones called PSF, it will be PSF 1, 2, 3, 4, something like that. Then I'll click on the sigma function, bring up the average star data, and then click on its camera icon and generate a second PSF. And then I crop down the first image to match the size of the second one, and use the histogram tool to bring down the level. So we'll go through that in the functional example here in a second. All right, so another major part of doing deconvolution in PixInsight is generating a star mask. And we need to do this because we have to protect high-frequency elements. So like I was telling Tolga, stars are effectively impulse functions. It goes from, you know, very dark to very bright very quickly, and usually over a span of a pixel or two, you know, or at least not many pixels. So this is a high-frequency element, and deconvolution by nature will create these ringing artifacts around stars. So you know, you can see in the bottom an example. So here's a star. I ran deconvolution on this synthetic star without you know, any protection of any kind, and you get this ringing effect around it. So you get this very dark lane, then a brighter lane, very much like looking at a diffraction-limited star in a telescope. You know, a perfect direct diffraction-limited star. So you get that effect, and we need to protect against it. Things like hot, cold pixels, you know, these will create the same effect. So the data needs to be as clean as you can when you're coming into deconvolution, so you don't have as little of that as possible. This is one of the other reasons why noise can be a real issue, because you have some noise data will stick up above the rest for just one pixel, for example, and that kind of throws the algorithms off. So the star mask is used somewhat indirectly to reduce these ringing artifacts. It defines where these high-frequency elements are at, so deconvolution knows how to protect against the ringing in that area. So a good mask is very critical in getting a good deconvolution result here. In order to get good masks, you know, sometimes you have to actually go through multiple steps. The example data I provided is pretty easy in this respect. Most of the stars are a reasonably similar brightness level, and so I was able to generate a star mask in one pass. But sometimes you actually have to go through multiple steps. You know, generate one star mask and, you know, use one set of scales and one set of smoothness values and things like that, and then make another one, and then another one for different sized or different brightness stars, and then combine them with a max function or addition or something like that. So before I go on to this part of the mask generation, was there any questions on those other two?
I haven't seen any questions yet, and I'm just posting the link to your data right now. It was on Google, but now I'm posting it in YouTube, so everyone will have access to it.
Okay. So PixInsight's deconvolution tool has some parameters to reduce its effect on noisy areas. However, using a mask can provide much more control over this process. So I almost always use a mask with deconvolution. Masks can be as simple as cloning the image and extracting the likeness if it's a color image, or just taking a copy of it and stretching it with a default screen transfer function. You know, you set the background level to 0.25 and move on, right? So you can use a very simple mask like that, and the effect of that will be allowing deconvolution to work on high contrast or high signal to noise ratio areas, and not affect the low signal-to-noise ratio areas. I'm going to show a different technique that allows deconvolution to work on high contrast regions. So I'm actually looking for different structure sizes and where those things exist, and allowing deconvolution to work across both the high and low boundary across those. In some cases, you'll have a high dynamic range object like M42. These require some sort of HDR effect on the mask before you can actually start doing the contrast enhancement. And I'll go through a little bit of that here. That's just so that you can actually see the contrast between the different structures. So this contrast-based mask is fairly straightforward. It may seem a little convoluted here, but when I go through the example, you see it actually goes pretty quickly. So with the data we have, I just clone the image, rename it. I use the default auto stretch and the screen transfer function, apply it to the histogram transformation process, and then apply that to the image to stretch it permanently. I clone that image, rename it a NR mask for noise reduction mask, which I'll use later, and then I adjust the shadows and highlights on this data sum because there was a little bit of adjustment that was needed, and then did this HDR multiscale transform, which you can see the settings I used over here. Then I make another clone of the deconvolution mask image, rename it to something else. In this case, I chose temp. And then I ran several passes of local histogram equalization. So this is a contrast enhancement function, and you can see that I'm using different kernel sizes, right? I'm starting with a larger one and dropping it down to increase the contrast between different sized objects, that's sized in terms of pixels, right? And then I also did a pass of multi-scale transform for some of the smaller scales, right? So you can see here the multi-scale transform, I'm affecting scales, from 2 to 32, where the local histogram equalization is affecting sizes from 256 down to 32. And the goal here is really just to boost the contrast of these different structure sizes. And then we're going to use those to identify. So this next step is taking the deconvolution mask and this temp image and subtracting them. We're taking the absolute difference of them. And the goal is just to see what has changed, right? What's increased in intensity, what's decreased in intensity. Anything that's below 0 will get boosted, it'll be negative, but the absolute value will make that positive. So you're actually increasing both sides of it. And then I modulate it by the original image, so that since the original image has the intensities of the image in there, that modulates it by high signal noise ratio areas. And I found in general I need this bias, so to kind of boost the signals noise area response a little bit more, I add in some amount of the noise reduction mask, which is essentially a copy of the image stretched but without an HDR transform on it. One thing to note here is I have the rescale result option turned on. This function isn't going to return something in 0 to 1, even if your image is in 0 to 1. It's going to be off because of the difference in the multiplication involved. So turn that on before you run this process. And then this is applied to the deconvolution mask image, and you get some sort of result here that we'll see in a minute. Generally, there's some noise in this image. So I use TGV denoise to typically reduce this. I start with the settings that you see here. You can see that I'm using the noise reduction mask as a support image, because this actually has a model of the original image in it, even though the deconvolution mask no longer does. And then I apply this process to the deconvolution mask. Generally, I'll use preview areas to do that. So once this is done, you have all the support images necessary to do your deconvolution. So that's, a good portion of the setup here. Has there been any other questions on getting these support images set up?
I don't see any more.
All right.
Actually, I have a quick question.
Sure.
When you're applying denoise to the mask, are you using any mask for it?
No, in this case I'm not. I'm just allowing it to run completely open. And that's because I'm not looking for absolute perfection in the image, this mask data. I'm looking for it to be pretty close and identify, these high contrast regions. That I don't need it to be perfect, so I don't worry about masking the deconvolution mask when doing this.
So I have a question. So this is John Hayes. So I usually just do a convolution on that mask using, say, a very small kernel just to even out any variations, and it makes the mask just a tiny bit bigger, just to kind of get it to go over little edges and things. What do you think of that approach as opposed to, say, using TGV denoise?
I think it's very good if you're using like a straight luminance. I assume that's generally what you're doing. You have a luminance.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
That works pretty well. That way, if you have a contrast between like a dark nebula and some emission nebula next to it, the mask will overlap the edge a little bit, and so you get a little more effect across that.
Right.
So
and my concern is always I just don't want to print through any of the noise in that mask onto the underlying result.
Exactly right. And the difference here is that I'm actually making a mask that is showing the contrasting structures. And so it's not exactly the same as using a straight luminance mask. You'll kind of see how it looks different when I go through the functional example. And so I don't really want to destroy those edges. I just want to get rid of the fine grain noise so that I'm not having that affect the deconvolution result.
Right.
All right. So now you get into deconvolution itself. So since we've created a point spread function from our image, you can click the external PSF tab and just select that particular image. You can see an example of that one here. In general, I start with 25 iterations of the regularized Richardson-Lucy algorithm. I'm generally doing this on monochrome data, but you can certainly do it on a color image. If you are, I would definitely use the luminance target. The problem there is that you may have different point spread functions within the color channels, right? So unless you separate the channels, you can separate the channels and do it on each of them individually, but you need to measure the point spread function for each of the channels individually if you're going to do that. So generally, I like to work with a monochrome image. That way I have better control over it, a better model of the point spread function. I almost always use deringing and local deringing. The local deringing is what uses the star mask. And in general, I use a global dark 0.005. This may vary a little bit depending on your data. Generally, my monochrome CCD image data, when it's coming in, the global dark of 0.005 works very well. But you may actually see that this is not allowing enough deconvolution effect, and you need to increase it if you have very bright backgrounds. So you may need to vary it a little bit, but these are good places to start. I typically start with a couple previews over, some regions that have both bright and dark areas with some object of interest in the preview, and I'll just, start running a test and see what happens. Right? What do I get out of my deconvolution result? And then what I'll do is, without any masks applied to the image itself, I'll go through and adjust the wavelet regularization. So this is PixInsight deconvolution protection of noise, right? So what you're setting here is how well this protects different scale of noise. So the scale of 1 is basically, 1 pixel to the next. Scale of 2 is every other pixel. Scale of 3 is every 4th pixel, so forth and so on. So you're looking at different scales of noise. And generally, you want this kind of downward trend, right? So as you increase the wavelet layers, you'll see a change here, where you're affecting the smallest layer the most, or protecting the smallest layer the most. So really what you can think of these thresholds is how much they are protecting that size of noise. So generally I'll do that until I'm not getting too much of an effect. I'll allow some amount of noise to be boosted in the dark regions, but not too much. And then once I've got that set up, then I go and start changing the iterations, increasing or decreasing the number of iterations until I'm getting a result that looks good. And generally I'm looking for something that isn't looking like it's becoming chunky, artificially chunky, or I'm boosting too much noise, and even in the high signal-to-noise ratio areas, right? So I'm looking for things like that to show up, and then I'll decrease it if that starts to happen. And then once I'm happy with the results on my preview, I just go ahead and test everything on the main image, right? Now, once you get to the main image, you may say, well, this worked great on my preview, but I found this other area over here that doesn't look quite as good. Maybe I need to go back and do some tweaks, make another preview that covers that area, or just change the settings a little bit and try it again, right? So generally what I'm looking for is an image that's kind of been snapped into focus, like if you've ever been visually looking through the eyepiece and you're changing the focus and suddenly it just looks sharp, right? That's kind of what I'm looking for. So even though the original image may not have really looked blurry, after you deconvolve it, you can kind of see it pull together like, that looks a lot clearer now. So here's a few examples. So the image on the left is the convolved image that I'm going to use in my test case. The lower left is running deconvolution full out with no restrictions. You can see all the noise that happens. The edges are definitely sharper, but there's a lot of noise that's amplified. You get ringing around the stars and things like this. Not necessarily a pretty result. And then on the upper right, we have deconvolution with de-ringing and star support, and just using noise limitations to keep it from affecting the backgrounds too much. So you can see it's still creating a little bit of modeling effect in the background, but it's not terrible, right? The lower right is doing the same thing, except now I'm using a luminance mask like John was talking about what he uses. So this just keeps it deconvolution from affecting the darker areas in the mask, the background areas that have low signal-to-noise ratio. And the one in the middle is the process that I've described here for doing the contrast mask. And you can see it's maybe a little bit better, especially in this nebulous region where we have enough signal-to-noise ratio we can get a little bit of gain in some of these structures. But we're really not boosting the noise in the dark areas anymore. So here's a couple other results, and you can kind of see from left to right the kind of snap into focus effect, right? So on the left, I mean, it looks pretty good at this scale, and it doesn't really look bad. And then you look at the right, and it's like, that looks a lot sharper, right? I'm seeing a bit more detail and contrast in the image. All right, so before I get into the functional stuff, any questions? Nope.
David, I have one question for you that
Sure.
you didn't touch on as much. How do you look at using deconvolution in combination with drizzle stacking? And do they have any interplay, or is it just whatever data
They
get out?
do, right? So I may have mentioned this in one of the earlier slides and skipped past it. The deconvolution really works best if you have your point spread function covers more stars, right? So if you have a more accurate model of a star, it is better sampled. You can get a better result from deconvolution, provided the signal-to-noise ratio is good. So in general, like you and I, Josh, I know we use drizzle a lot to essentially improve the sampling of our images, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so by improving the sampling, we get a better model of the point spread function, and we can get a little bit more out of processes like deconvolution, right?
Yes.
So yes, absolutely, it does have an effect. I like using those in combination together at 100%.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was just trying to bring out, is that I think that for some reason I forgot to bring that up before, but I think it gives a better effect on the deconvolution if you do drizzle stack, and then you can downsize later.
Yeah, and you know, the same thing is true if you're using a large aperture instrument and you're sampling at 0.3 arc seconds per pixel or something like that. You know, you're going to get a better deconvolution result from that data as well, simply because you have a better model of the stars, right?
Yep.
There's also a larger difference between your structures and your fine scale noise in data like that, right? So even your stars cover multiple pixels typically in those scenarios, right? So your typical, you know, low frequency noise, or sorry, high frequency noise is easier to separate out and deal with. All right, so
David, before we move on, can I ask one more question about this? So when you actually, this is the perfect screen you just brought up. When you're picking these stars, do you have any tips on which stars to pick and which stars not to pick? Is there a better star than?
Yeah, absolutely, Tolga. So, like I mentioned in the presentation, that I try to stray away from stars that look like they're too bright or too dim. The rule of thumb I use for that is what the function is that is identified, right? So if I come in and pick, say, this really bright star down here, I'm going to try to add it into my list. So I click this one. You can see how it shows up as Gaussian, right? If I unstretch my data, you can see it's overexposed. Most of the pixels in the middle are all white, right? So this star is overexposed, and you can see it shows up as a Gaussian because it doesn't fit it very well. It thinks the top is too flat. Likewise, stars that are too dim, you know, if I go off and